Warning, this content may be upsetting or disturbing to some audiences. Hikers of Reddit, what has been the most fucked up thing you've seen?
This was 2 decades ago. They used to do donkey tours in the Grand Canyon. You ride the donkey and then hike. You can camp, but we did the day tour. A woman that was probably in her late 60s/early 70s was in front of me and, on an incline, started to act strange. She was swaying left and right on a steep cliff, which was very safe and wide. It swayed back and forth for maybe a minute, and she was slumped over, and then boom, it looked like she passed out, pulled the donkey to the left, and fell over the cliff. I saw her tumble over, and then they were just gone. I can't remember how far down the fall was, but it had to be over 100 feet. Immediately the guy jumped off at the front, ran over and let out an audible scream before stopping after realizing she had a tour with her. A few people got off their donkey, and she stopped them from peering over. A few of the other guides looked over, and they made some radio calls, and then we proceeded. It was very obvious that something really serious had happened, but we never found out. I'm pretty sure I watched a woman and a donkey fall to their death in the Grand Canyon. I had hiked 15 miles to an alpine wilderness and had just laid down for the night when a young guy in shorts and no bag popped out and asked me if I had water. I, of course, shared my water. He immediately said he had been hiking since yesterday. Apparently, he and his friend went way back and off trail, skirting some cliffs along the way. Then he just says half jokingly, yeah, his brains are everywhere. I laughed half-acidly, but he was sending off a really deadly vibe, not dangerous, just stone cold shock. I asked him to clarify that last part and offered him food and a cigarette. I also ordered him to sit down. He didn't want to because he would lose his legs if he sat now, but I explained he needed to sit a while. Long story short, his friend slipped and fell, and when he hit, his head popped and then his body got wedged in a crevasse. The guy I was talking to had spent all the previous day hiking around the cliff to find his friend, then had to hike out of the valley up the ridge and down again, all on Taylor's slope off trail. He was absolutely shredded, skinned, tore up. He was begging me to come with him and help me get his friend out of the hills. That's the part that really stuck with me. He got up and was about 3 feet into the bush when I grabbed him gently and said, "Hey, I got a phone, we'll see if emergency service works." Somehow it did, and I have zero idea how technically or otherwise. We were standing in a glacial cratered alpine lake, 15 miles from the trailhead. I got rescued up there, and man, I was super impressed with their response. Within a few hours, the first group of volunteers were passing my camp. These guys all looked like supermen, and they were. All night afterwards, a constant stream of rescue volunteers. I stayed in camp and made a comfy spot for them to rest on the way down. They had to wait up there in whiteout conditions for 6 nights, but rather than leave, they kept a constant vigil over the hiker's dead body. When the weather broke, a chopper flew in and took them all out. I've never been so deeply moved and impressed with that kind of selflessness in something we regard as a hobby, a sport. Words that take away the very dangerous nature of it. Read all these stories, and it seems most are deaths by slip and fall. Happens too easy, don't take the chance with your life. A few years ago, a new hiking buddy climbed up a waterfall, slipped on some pine needles on the top and fell 40 feet down onto a rock. I was the first person there, blood pouring out of his head, broken spine, shine broke through the skin. He bit below his mouth and pretty much had a second mouth. It took an hour or 2 for medics to get to us and another 2 hours to use ropes to lift him out of the valley to a helicopter. Miraculously, he was out of the hospital after a few months and eventually regained full movement. All medical experts were shocked he made a full recovery. The most traumatic event of my life by far. I was in the Frank Church Wilderness in Idaho doing some biological survey work. We were 30 miles from the nearest trailhead and got an early start to avoid the heat. About a mile into our hike, we hear the bushes stir near the trail. Up pops a man wearing nothing but a loincloth and Nikes carrying a small bag and a hunting rifle. He says morning and takes off sprinting down the trail. Never did see him again, so many questions. A few years ago, my wife and her friends were out east of Portland, Oregon on a really hot weekend and, on their way to Hood River, decided to stop at a place called Punch Bowl to cool off. They were going to be fast, so they just brought bathing suits and flip-flops and were just going to run up the mile-plus/trail to jump in, jump out, and keep driving. They had just arrived at Punch Bowl and were greeted by a fairly sizable crowd, maybe 75 to 100 people total spread out. They had just gotten out from swimming when they saw a little trail of smoke. Within minutes the small trail of smoke is huge, and a noticeable smell is growing. A few folks get spooked and leave to the parking lot only to return panicked shortly after saying a firewall had blocked the trail. They immediately call 911, and within a few minutes, a helicopter's over them and begins dropping notes on caution tape down to the group saying, "Run." Large fire spreading fast, head down, followed very quickly after with trail consumed, stay put. The fire is visible now and rapidly growing. A volunteer somehow got back there with a map and GPS and mapped out a possible route to escape as long as winds sustained their current models. Ultimately, through 36 hours of terror, they hiked 15 miles plus on rugged terrain barefoot in bathing suits in the middle of what later came to be the Eagle Creek fire that almost torched the whole side of the Columbia River Valley, escaping with their lives. However, my wife still suffers some PTSD when she smells campfires. She said that for essentially 12 to 14 hours total of it, they had zero ideas of where they were going, if there was any remote chance of getting out, or even if they were going the right way following this group. All 75 plus people made it out okay. Pretty incredible teamwork. I was in the Grand Canyon in 2008 during a huge flash flood that ran through there at the time. We were camping down at the bottom after a couple of big days of backpacking around, and it tore through the middle of the night. The waters went up 60 or 70 feet, and everyone fled up the cliff walls for their lives. A couple people were swept over by the large falls. We saw bears running down and scrambling up trees before they fell over. But the craziest thing I saw was a woman with a baby strapped to her back climbing across one of those river jumping ropes to get to a boulder on the other side before they got swept away. She was 2 or 3 feet over the water, shooting down there at crazy speeds, carrying massive trees crashing down along the way. We were terrified for them. So about 5 years ago, a friend and I were hiking in the Oregon Cascades in the mid-spring. We were about 6 miles from the road, nowhere near a trail on about 6 feet of snow. We were going out for 5 days to attempt to summit a few peaks, so we looked like grizzly mountain men. Around a tree comes 2 guys and a dog. Mid-50s, his son mid-20s, and Fifi. They are wearing trail running shorts, running shoes and a running water backpack. AKA, nothing of real use. "PCT open?" they asked. A friend and I looked at each other, looked at them, tried not to laugh and explained. "We are 5 miles from the PCT and 2,000 feet lower in elevation. What are you trying to do?" They planned on doing a 20-mile run along the PCT starting on the other side of the mountains but got sidetracked due to snow. Again, we explain that they are fucked. I tell them that there is a road with cell service 6 miles downhill along our tracks, and if need be, we can hike them out. They refused and asked if the PCT was open again. I flat out told them, "You are fucked. Let me hike you out." They were like, "Nah, we've got this," and ran off in the wrong direction. We camped there for the night and followed their tracks for a half mile the next morning. They disappeared, no signs of them. After a few stormy days and failed summit attempts, we hiked out. I drove around to the parking area they mentioned and looked through the wilderness permit tags to find a name. Nothing. It gets weird, though. A few years later, my parents ran into the same nondescript people in the same area again asking about a trail loop, same conditions. Late winter, snowshoeing far from a road, and they were lost. My dad also tried to hike them out, but they refused and took off in the wrong direction. He followed their tracks for a half mile before he lost them. So, if anyone sees the ghosts of the Oregon Cascades, let me know. I did a wilderness survival course when I was a teen, so I have a few of these. I've told the forest fire story a million times in similar threads. Probably the next best one would be Giardia, in a situation where we couldn't get medevac out there for quite some time. Giardia is already an awful thing to contract when you can have quick access to any semblance of privacy and comfort. But it's a camper's disease, so that's usually not true, and it wasn't here either. One of the girls got it, and by the time they called for medevac, she had been mildly symptomatic for a few days, and because of weather conditions, they had to send a truck, which took quite some time. So, she was in the thick of it for a couple days in the camp. We dug a separate hole for her to shit in. We all had to assist with her care but also keep away because of how crazy contagious it is. Edit, crazy contagious if you can't stay clear of other people's poop, which we really couldn't. But because this was a treatment establishment, she couldn't be out of loss of staff for very long, so she basically just lived next to her shit trough. I think the scariest part for me was, initially, she was embarrassed. What teen girl, or anyone, TBH, wouldn't be if their peers had to hear and see them having explosive diarrhea into a hole? I heard her cry to staff about it, beg for privacy, etc. But the scary part was that by day 2, so much energy and life had faded out of her, and she was so bad off that all semblance of embarrassment, shyness, etc. had completely left her. She just sort of laid next to the trough and kept her pants down, and scooted backwards towards it when she needed to go. When she wasn't shitting, she was in a lot of pain, so she'd just sort of lie there and moan. I genuinely thought she was going to die. Giardia isn't a death sentence at all, very survivable, but 15-year-old me didn't know that, and watching it happen was one of the scariest things I've ever seen. I walked past a campsite with many smashed alcohol bottles and trash. Started feeling uncomfortable and walked faster to where the trail looked over a canyon. Smelled something bad and looked down to see, 3 feet from me, 2 bloated dead dog heads sticking out from a rolled up tarp. Immediately turned around and booked it to my car. I called the Forest Service to report it. I think some people got drunk and killed the dogs, or maybe it was a dog fighting thing. There may have been more under that tarp, but I was freaked out. I think if it was someone's pets, they would have tried to bury them. When I was a teenager, we went away for a week of camping at the Scout Reserve. My dad was our scoutmaster, and we were mostly all friends from growing up. There was one kid, Andre, the youngest, that we didn't really know well and was definitely kind of weird, withdrawn and awkward, just kinda different, but still a sweet guy that everyone liked. Toward the end of the week, we went out on an overnight, just the scouts, without my dad or his buddy, who was our other scouter. We took a boat across the lake and then hiked for hours into the bush. It was a really hot day, and my older brother was leading us but not drinking any water and wearing a light jacket which made him extra hot. Eventually, we found a sweet spot next to a huge cliff which we jumped off into the lake below for hours until we made a fire and cooked dinner. We all fell asleep under the stars. Around 4:30 a.m., just before sunrise, my friend Sean woke me up and asked if I knew where Andre was. I said no and that maybe he went to piss, but after 5 minutes, he wasn't back, so we got up and started looking around and calling his name. Nothing. So, we ranged a little further, and then I saw his sleeping bag at the edge of the cliff. I freaked out and ran over to see if I could see anything at the bottom, but I saw nothing. We tried to get my brother up, but he was pretty sick from heat stroke, so I took charge of the situation. We started ranging out into the woods and calling his name. One of the guys started doing the emergency whistle call, 3 short whistles, but we were really in the middle of nowhere. I started going deeper into the woods, calling his name. Then I thought I heard something, and I stopped and listened and heard a faint cry deep in the woods. So I started running, crashing through thick undergrowth, getting lashed in the face with branches and stumbling across fallen logs. His cries got louder, and eventually, I arrived at this huge clearing in the woods to find him sitting on a fallen tree in his underwear and a t-shirt. He said he'd been there for hours, having woken up on the ground in the dark and having no idea where he was, so he just sat it out, waiting for dawn. It was really spooky. The craziest thing was that his watch had been reset, so he didn't know what time it actually was. We all accepted that it was probably sleepwalking. Still, he was so far in the woods and didn't have a scratch on him, and this clearing was so bizarre because it was big and round in the middle of these really dense woods. To this day, I wonder what really happened. Thanks for listening to Radio TTS. Hit the subscribe button and activate the notification bell for more videos. Click the right box for the Radio TTS playlist and let us know what the next video should be about.